The stench of cheap whiskey hung in the air like the desert heat as Ruby Anderson watched her uncle count the bundle of crumpled bills that would determine her fate. At 18 years old, she never imagined she'd be standing on an auction block in the dusty town of Copper Springs, Arizona Territory, 1878, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder like a prized mare. Uncle Thaddeus had wasted no time after her parents' death 3 months prior. Their small ranch had fallen into his greedy hands, along with Ruby herself, her father's will having tragically named his only brother as guardian until she turned 21 or married. But Thaddeus Anderson had debts, dangerous ones, and Ruby was merely another asset to liquidate. "Gentlemen, feast your eyes on this fine young filly," Thaddeus slurred, yanking Ruby forward by her elbow. The gathering crowd of rough-looking men eyed her with undisguised interest. Some were local ranchers, others were drifters and gamblers from the saloon. All looked at her with hunger that made her skin crawl. "Healthy as a horse, works hard, and ain't bad to look at neither," Thaddeus continued, circling around her like a vulture. Ruby fought back tears, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. The pale pink dress she wore, her mother's Sunday best, hastily altered, felt like a costume in this grotesque theater. "Starting bid is $50, Thaddeus announced, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. "That's a bargain for a wife who can cook, clean, and help work your land." A leathery old rancher with yellowed teeth raised his hand. 50, 60, called a portly man, whose breath Ruby could smell from 10 feet away. 75, shouted another, a man with cruel eyes who'd been eyeing her since she was brought out. The bidding continued, each number driving a stake deeper into Ruby's heart. She searched the faces in the crowd, hoping for a sympathetic glance, a signal that someone might help. But there was nothing, just greed and lust and the occasional calculating stare of a man assessing her worth as property. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the makeshift auction yard behind her uncle's saloon. The air cooled, but Ruby's panic rose. Once the sale was complete, she'd be handed over immediately. Her uncle had made that perfectly clear. The bidding had reached $120 when the thunder of hoofbeats cut through the commotion. Heads turned as a cloud of dust approached from the east, followed by the silhouette of a rider astride a powerful black stallion. The horse reared dramatically as the rider pulled hard on the reins, causing the crowd to scatter. "What in tarnation is the meaning of this?" the rider demanded, his voice deep and commanding. He dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing himself to be a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dust-covered duster and worn leather chaps. Ruby couldn't help but stare. He was younger than most of the men in the crowd, perhaps in his mid-20s, with intense eyes that scanned the scene with obvious disgust. His dark hair fell just below his hat brim, and a week's worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. A star-shaped badge gleamed on his chest, catching the last rays of sunlight. "This here's a private auction, Marshal," Thaddeus said, his voice suddenly less confident. "Nothing against the law." The marshal stepped closer, spurs jingling with each deliberate step. "Isaac Prescott," he introduced himself, though he spoke to the crowd rather than to Thaddeus. "New federal marshal for this territory." His gaze fell on Ruby, and something flashed across his features, anger, perhaps, or determination. "And I believe selling human beings became illegal some years back, after a rather significant war." "Now, see here," Thaddeus protested. "I ain't selling no slave. This is my niece, and I'm merely arranging a marriage." "Against her will for money," Marshal Prescott finished, stepping onto the wooden platform. He towered over Thaddeus, who took an instinctive step back. "That's not a marriage arrangement. That's trafficking." Ruby felt her heart pounding in her chest. No one had ever stood up to her uncle before, certainly not on her behalf. Thaddeus was feared in Copper Springs. He owned the saloon, held debts over half the town, and had friends in low places who handled his problems. "The law gives me rights as her guardian," Thaddeus argued, though his voice had lost its earlier bluster. "Her pa named me as such." "The law also gives her rights as a citizen," the marshal countered. He turned to Ruby. "Miss, are you here of your own free will?" For a moment, Ruby couldn't find her voice. She'd spent months being told to keep quiet, to be grateful her uncle hadn't thrown her to the wolves after her parents' passing. But something in the marshal's steady gaze gave her courage. "No, sir," she said. her voice stronger than she expected. "My parents died 3 months ago. My uncle was named my guardian, but he's selling me to pay his gambling debts." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some looked away, suddenly finding the ground interesting. Others backed away, not wanting to be associated with what was clearly turning into a legal matter. "That true?" the marshal asked Thaddeus, whose face had turned an alarming shade of purple. "She's lying. Ungrateful little—" "Watch your tongue," Marshal Prescott warned, his hand moving slightly toward the revolver at his hip. "Now, I suggest we all disperse. This auction is finished. Anyone who has a problem with that can discuss it with me personally." His eyes scanned the crowd, but no one stepped forward to challenge him. One by one, the bidders melted away until only Ruby, her uncle, and the marshal remained in the yard. The tension between the two men was palpable. "This ain't over," Thaddeus growled, but he backed away nonetheless. "She's still my ward until she's 21. The law will have plenty to say about a man who auctions off his own kin," Marshal Prescott interrupted. "I suggest you sober up and consider your next move carefully, Anderson. I'll be watching." When Thaddeus had skulked back into his saloon, the marshal turned to Ruby. Up close, she could see his eyes were a striking shade of blue, like the sky after a storm. "Are you hurt, Miss Anderson?" he asked, his voice gentler now. "No, sir," Ruby replied, though in truth, her uncle's grip had left bruises on her arms more than once. "But I have nowhere to go. Everything my parents owned, our ranch, our livestock, it all went to him." The marshal frowned. "You said your father named him guardian. Was there a will?" Ruby nodded. "Yes, but I've never seen it. Uncle Thaddeus said it gave him control of everything until I turned 21, or married." "I'd like to see this will myself," Marshal Prescott said. "In the meantime, you need somewhere safe to stay." He seemed to consider for a moment. "Mrs. Holbrook runs a boarding house for respectable women. I can arrange for you to stay there tonight." "I have no money," Ruby admitted, shame coloring her cheeks. "Consider it an advance on justice," the marshal said with a small smile. "Come on. I'll take you there now, before your uncle decides to cause more trouble." As they walked through the darkening streets, Ruby was acutely aware of curious eyes watching from windows and doorways. Copper Springs was a small town, fewer than 500 souls, and word would spread fast that the new marshal had intervened in Thaddeus Anderson's business. "You're new here," Ruby observed, partly to break the silence and partly because she was genuinely curious. "What brought you to Copper Springs?" Marshal Prescott guided his horse alongside them as they walked. "The territory needs law and order if it's ever going to become a proper state. I go where I'm needed." He glanced at her. "Seems I arrived just in time." Ruby felt a rush of gratitude. "Thank you, Marshal. If you hadn't come when you did—" "Isaac," he corrected gently. "When we're not in official capacity, you can call me Isaac." "Isaac," she repeated, liking the sound of it. "I'm Ruby." "I know," he said with a smile that transformed his serious face. "Your uncle was quite loud about advertising your qualities." Ruby blushed furiously. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." "Don't apologize for him," Isaac said firmly. "Not ever." They reached the boarding house, a neat 2-story structure with lace curtains in the windows. Mrs. Holbrook, a plump widow with kind eyes, answered the door and listened gravely as Isaac explained the situation. "Of course she can stay," Mrs. Holbrook said, ushering Ruby inside. "I've got a room at the back that's quiet and private." Isaac tipped his hat. "I'll come by tomorrow morning. We'll figure this out, Miss Anderson." As Ruby watched him walk away, leading his magnificent black horse down the street, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. That night, in the small but clean room at Mrs. Holbrook's boarding house, Ruby slept better than she had since her parents' deaths. The knowledge that someone had stood up for her, that someone cared what happened to her, was like a balm to her wounded spirit. Morning brought sunshine streaming through the curtains and the smell of coffee and biscuits from downstairs. Ruby found a simple calico dress laid out for her left by Mrs. Holbrook, who explained that one of her other boarders had outgrown it. "Marshal Prescott paid for a week's board," Mrs. Holbrook told her over breakfast. "Says he's going to sort out this business with your uncle." Ruby felt embarrassment heat her cheeks. "I'll find a way to repay him." Mrs. Holbrook patted her hand. That young man doesn't strike me as someone expecting repayment. First day in town, and he's already making waves. She leaned forward conspiratorially. Between you and me, we could use a lawman with some backbone around here. Your uncle and his cronies have been running roughshod over decent folks for too long. Ruby was helping clear the breakfast dishes when a knock came at the door. Isaac stood on the porch, looking somehow even taller and more imposing in the daylight. His badge caught the morning sun, and his duster had been replaced with a clean blue shirt that matched his eyes. "Morning, Miss Anderson," he greeted her, hat in hand. "I was hoping you might accompany me to the county clerk's office. I'd like to look into this guardianship matter." Ruby wiped her hands on her borrowed apron. "Of course. Let me just tell Mrs. Holbrook." The ride to the county offices took them through the center of town. Ruby was painfully aware of the stares that followed them. Some were curious, others hostile, particularly from the men who frequented her uncle's saloon. "Don't mind them," Isaac said, noticing her discomfort. "Small towns run on gossip, but they also respect the law when it's properly enforced." "You don't know my uncle?" Ruby said quietly. "He doesn't respect anything but money and power." "Men like your uncle exist everywhere," Isaac replied. "They only thrive when good people look the other way. That stops now, at least in Copper Springs." At the clerk's office, they found a harried young man named Jenkins sorting through stacks of documents. "Marshal?" Jenkins greeted Isaac nervously. "What can I help you with?" "I need to see the will of Joseph Anderson, filed approximately 3 months ago," Isaac said. "His daughter is here to review it as well." Jenkins looked uncomfortable. I'm not sure I can locate that right away. The files are somewhat disorganized." Isaac leaned forward slightly. "Jenkins, is there a problem I should know about?" The clerk's eyes darted to Ruby, then back to Isaac. "Mr. Anderson Thaddeus, that is, he sometimes reviews certain documents before they're properly filed." Ruby felt her stomach clench. "Are you saying my uncle tampered with my father's will?" "I'm not saying anything," Jenkins protested, sweat beading on his forehead. "Just that, well, he does a lot of business in town, holds a lot of notes. People tend to accommodate him." Isaac's jaw tightened. "Jenkins, I want to see whatever document was filed as Joseph Anderson's will. Now." Under the marshal's stern gaze, Jenkins reluctantly pulled a leather-bound volume from a shelf and leafed through it until he found what he was looking for. "Here's the record of it being filed," he said, showing them a ledger entry. "But the actual document?" He rummaged through a stack of papers. Here." The will was shorter than Ruby expected, just a single page with her father's unmistakable signature at the bottom. She read it quickly, her heart sinking. "This isn't right," she said, looking up at Isaac with dismay. "My father would never have given Uncle Thaddeus complete control over everything. He always said the ranch would be mine." She pointed to a paragraph near the bottom. "And this part about authority to arrange suitable marriage, my father would never have written that." Isaac studied the document carefully. "The handwriting changes slightly in this paragraph," he observed, pointing to the section Ruby had questioned. "And the ink is a different shade. Jenkins, when was this will filed?" The clerk consulted his ledger. 3 days after Joseph Anderson's death." "And who brought it in?" Jenkins swallowed hard. "Thaddeus Anderson." Isaac's expression hardened. "I believe we're looking at a forged document. Mr. Jenkins, I'm confiscating this as evidence." "You can't," Jenkins began, but wilted under Isaac's glare. "I can, and I am," Isaac said firmly. "Tampering with legal documents is a federal offense." He carefully folded the will and tucked it inside his vest. "Miss Anderson, I believe your uncle has been lying about more than just this auction." As they left the clerk's office, Ruby felt a strange mixture of anger and vindication. "I knew it," she said. "I knew my father wouldn't have left me at Uncle Thaddeus's mercy." "The question is what your father actually intended," Isaac said as they walked back toward his horse. "Do you know if he had a lawyer who might have helped prepare a legitimate will?" Ruby thought for a moment. "Mr. Garfield in Phoenix handled his business matters. They corresponded regularly." She bit her lip. "But Phoenix is nearly 100 miles away." "Then we'll send a telegram," Isaac decided. "I know the circuit judge is due in town next week. If we can prove forgery, we might be able to have the guardianship overturned." A shout from down the street interrupted their conversation. Thaddeus Anderson was striding toward them, his face mottled with rage. Two men flanked him, Silas Burke and Jim Roper, local toughs who did his dirty work. "There she is!" Thaddeus bellowed, pointing at Ruby. "Running off with my property in the middle of the night." Isaac stepped in front of Ruby protectively. "That's close enough, Anderson," Thaddeus sneered. "You've got no right to interfere in family business, Marshal. The girl is legally in my custody." "About that," Isaac said calmly. "I've just been reviewing the will that granted you that custody. Interesting document, especially the parts that appear to have been added after your brother signed it." Ruby saw a flash of uncertainty cross her uncle's face before it hardened again. "Nonsense," Thaddeus spat. "That will is legal and binding. Now step aside and let me take my niece home." "She's staying at the boarding house for now," Isaac said, his hand resting casually near his holster. "And you're going to leave her alone while I investigate this matter further." Thaddeus laughed, an ugly sound. "You're new here, Marshal. You don't understand how things work in Copper Springs. I own half this town." "And I represent federal law," Isaac replied evenly. "Care to see which carries more weight?" A tense silence fell over the street. Townspeople had stopped to watch, sensing the confrontation brewing. Ruby could feel her heart hammering in her chest. But she stood tall beside Isaac, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. Finally, Thaddeus took a step back. "This isn't over," he growled, "not by a long shot." He jerked his head at his companions, and the three men retreated toward the saloon. Isaac turned to Ruby, concern evident in his eyes. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though she was trembling slightly. "He won't give up easily. He needs money badly. He's in debt to some dangerous men in Tucson." "All the more reason to solve this quickly," Isaac said. "Come on, let's send that telegram to Phoenix." At the telegraph office, they composed a message to Mr. Garfield, inquiring about Joseph Anderson's will and requesting any copies he might have retained. The operator promised to send it immediately. "Now we wait," Isaac said, as they stepped back onto the boardwalk. "It could be a day or two before we get a response." Ruby nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the past 24 hours. "I don't know how to thank you for all this, Marshal Isaac. Most people in town wouldn't dare cross my uncle." "I'm just doing my job," he said, but his smile suggested it was perhaps more than that. "And speaking of jobs, I could use some help organizing the marshal's office. Previous fellow left it in quite a state. Interested in earning some pocket money while we wait for news?" The marshal's office was indeed a disaster. Dusty wanted posters curling on the walls, haphazard stacks of paperwork on every surface, and filing cabinets whose contents appeared to have been sorted by a cyclone. "No wonder law and order's been lacking," Ruby remarked, surveying the chaos. "Where do we start?" They spent the day sorting papers, filing documents, and bringing some semblance of order to the office. Ruby found herself enjoying the work, and more importantly, enjoying Isaac's company. He was different from any man she'd met before, educated, principled, and genuinely kind. As they worked, he told her about growing up in Boston, the son of a judge who had instilled in him a deep respect for the law. He'd come west after the war, drawn by the opportunity to help bring justice to the frontier. "What about you?" he asked, as they broke for a late lunch of sandwiches Mrs. Holbrook had packed for them. "What was life like before all this?" Ruby told him about the small ranch her father had built, the herd of cattle they'd been slowly growing, and her mother's vegetable garden that had been the envy of neighboring farms. She spoke of her father's dreams of expanding, of breeding horses as well as cattle, and of sending Ruby to school in California someday. "It sounds like they loved you very much," Isaac said softly. "They did," Ruby agreed, blinking back sudden tears. "After the fever took them, everything happened so fast. Uncle Thaddeus moved into our home before they were even in the ground. He sold off most of the cattle right away, said it was to pay debts I never knew existed. Then he started drinking more, gambling away whatever was left." She looked down at her hands. "I tried to run the place myself, but he'd get angry when I questioned him, said I should be grateful he didn't throw me out." Isaac's expression darkened. No one deserves to be treated that way, especially not by family. As the afternoon waned, they had made considerable progress in bringing order to the office. Ruby was filing the last stack of wanted posters when the door burst open. A young boy stood there, out of breath. "Marshal, come quick! There's a fight at Anderson's saloon, guns drawn. Isaac was on his feet instantly, checking his revolver. Stay here, he told Ruby firmly. I'll be back as soon as I can. Ruby paced anxiously after he left, unable to sit still. Through the window, she could see people hurrying toward the saloon. The minutes stretched endlessly until finally she heard a gunshot, then another. Unable to bear the suspense any longer, she rushed out the door. The scene at the saloon was chaotic. A crowd had gathered outside, and Ruby pushed her way through until she could see what was happening. Isaac stood in the center of the street, his gun drawn. Across from him, Jim Roper was on the ground, clutching his shoulder and moaning. Thaddeus and Silas Burke were backing away slowly, hands raised. Next man who draws on me goes to jail or the cemetery, Isaac announced, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. Your choice. Ruby watched in awe as he efficiently disarmed both men, confiscated their weapons, and ordered the town doctor to tend to Roper's wound. The authority in his bearing, the confidence with which he handled the situation, it was like nothing she'd ever witnessed in Copper Springs. When Isaac finally spotted her in the crowd, his expression shifted from stern lawman to something softer, tinged with concern. He made his way over to her. I thought I told you to stay at the office, he said, though there was no real anger in his voice. I heard gunshots, Ruby explained. I was worried. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprised, perhaps, that someone would worry about him. It's handled now, he said. Your uncle and his friends decided to test my resolve. They miscalculated. As they walked back to the marshal's office, Ruby couldn't help but notice how people nodded respectfully to Isaac. Word of his confrontation would spread quickly, further cementing his authority in town. Will you arrest my uncle? She asked. Isaac shook his head. Not yet. Roper drew first, so I was justified in shooting him. The others backed down before they crossed that line. His jaw tightened. But they will try again, especially now that I've humiliated them publicly. Your uncle is not a man who forgets a slight. That evening, after escorting Ruby back to the boarding house, Isaac insisted on speaking with Mrs. Holbrook privately. When he returned to the parlor where Ruby waited, his expression was serious. I've asked Mrs. Holbrook to keep the doors locked tonight and to alert me if there's any disturbance, he explained. I don't think your uncle will try anything so soon after today's confrontation, but it's better to be cautious. Ruby nodded, touched by his concern. Thank you for everything you've done. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't arrived yesterday. I'm glad I got here when I did, Isaac said, his blue eyes intense as they met hers. For a moment, neither spoke, and Ruby felt a strange flutter in her chest. Then Isaac cleared his throat and reached for his hat. Get some rest. I'll come by in the morning to check on you. That night, Ruby dreamed of her parents' ranch as it had been before, green pastures dotted with cattle, her mother's flowers blooming around the porch, her father's laughter echoing across the yard. But in the dream, there was someone new, a tall figure with kind blue eyes, standing beside her as they watched the sunset together. She woke with a start, her cheeks warm. It was ridiculous to harbor such thoughts about a man she'd known for barely 2 days, especially a man who was only helping her because it was his duty. Yet, she couldn't deny the way her heart quickened when he smiled at her, or how safe she felt in his presence. The next day brought excitement in the form of a telegram from Phoenix. Mr. Garfield had responded promptly, confirming Ruby's suspicions. He did indeed have a copy of Joseph Anderson's actual will, which left the ranch and all assets to Ruby, with provisions for a trusted neighbor to serve as advisor until she turned 21. There was no mention of arranged marriages or Thaddeus having any authority over her. This changes everything, Isaac said, his eyes bright with triumph as they left the telegraph office. With this evidence and the forged will, we can prove your uncle's fraud. The judge will overturn the guardianship. Ruby felt lightheaded with relief. Does this mean I can go home, back to my parents' ranch? Once the judge makes his ruling, yes, Isaac confirmed. But that's still a few days away. In the meantime, he was interrupted by the sound of running footsteps. Mrs. Holbrook's teenage son, Timothy, came sprinting down the street toward them. Marshal! Miss Anderson! He gasped, skidding to a stop. It's your uncle, miss. He and his men, they're at your ranch. They're loading everything onto wagons, furniture, tools, everything that ain't nailed down. Ruby's blood ran cold. He's stripping the place bare. Isaac's expression hardened. He must have gotten wind of the telegram. He knows his time is running out. He turned to Ruby. Stay with Mrs. Holbrook. I'll handle this. No, Ruby said firmly. That's my home. I'm coming with you. Isaac looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Ruby's expression must have convinced him. All right, but you stay behind me, understand? Your uncle is desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. They rode hard, Isaac on his black stallion and Ruby on a mare borrowed from the livery. The Anderson Ranch lay 5 miles outside of town, nestled in a green valley fed by a year-round creek. As they crested the final hill, Ruby gasped in dismay. 3 wagons stood in the yard, already piled high with furniture, tools, and supplies. Thaddeus and his men were emerging from the house with more items: her mother's cherished rocking chair, her father's gun cabinet. That's far enough, Anderson, Isaac called out as they rode into the yard. Thaddeus whirled around, his face contorting with rage when he spotted Ruby. This is still my property, Marshal, and you're trespassing. Not according to Joseph Anderson's real will, Isaac replied, dismounting smoothly and helping Ruby down. We've received confirmation from his lawyer in Phoenix. This ranch belongs to Ruby, not you. Thaddeus's face paled, then flushed with anger. That old fool Garfield doesn't know what he's talking about. I have the will right here in town. You have a forgery, Isaac interrupted, and tampering with legal documents is a serious crime, as is selling human beings and theft of property. He gestured to the loaded wagons. I suggest you unload everything you've taken and leave peacefully. Otherwise, you'll be spending the next several years in a territorial prison. For a moment, it seemed Thaddeus might back down. Then, with a snarl of rage, he lunged for the rifle leaning against the nearest wagon. Ruby, down! Isaac shouted, pushing her behind him as he drew his revolver in one fluid motion. Gunfire erupted across the yard. Ruby pressed herself against the side of the house, heart pounding as bullets splintered wood and ricocheted off stone. Isaac had taken cover behind a water trough, returning fire with precise, measured shots. One of Thaddeus's men, not Silas or Roper, but a drifter, Ruby didn't recognize, cried out and fell, clutching his leg. Another threw down his gun and raised his hands in surrender. Cowards! Thaddeus screamed, firing wildly now. I'll kill you both. She was my ticket out of debt. Ruby spotted movement to her left. Silas Burke was creeping around the corner of the barn, trying to flank Isaac. Without thinking, she grabbed a nearby shovel and swung it with all her might as he passed. The metal blade connected with his head with a sickening thud, and he collapsed like a felled tree. The sudden noise distracted Thaddeus just long enough for Isaac to take careful aim. His shot caught Thaddeus in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying from his grasp. It's over, Anderson, Isaac said, approaching cautiously, his gun still trained on the older man. You're under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, human trafficking, and whatever else I can think of on the ride back to town. Thaddeus lay moaning in the dirt, clutching his bleeding shoulder and glaring murderously at his niece. You ungrateful little... That's enough! Isaac cut him off sharply. He looked at Ruby with concern. Are you hurt? She shook her head, still gripping the shovel tightly. No, but I think I might have killed that man. She gestured toward Silas's prone form. Isaac checked him quickly. He's breathing. Got a hard head, I reckon. He'll have a mighty headache when he wakes up. But that's the least of his worries. He looked at Ruby with newfound respect. That was quick thinking. I grew up on a ranch, she said simply. You learn to defend yourself. Within the hour, Isaac had all 3 men, Thaddeus, Silas, and the wounded drifter, secured in one of the wagons for transport back to town and the jail that awaited them. The 4th man, who had surrendered, was allowed to drive under Isaac's watchful eye. As they prepared to leave, Ruby took a moment to look around the ranch. Despite Thaddeus's efforts, much remained the land itself. The barn with its few remaining horses and cattle, and the house, though stripped of many furnishings, still stood solid and whole. It's going to take a lot of work to restore it, she said, half to herself. Isaac came to stand beside her. You'll manage. You're stronger than you know. She turned to him, suddenly overwhelmed with gratitude and other, more confusing emotions. I never properly thanked you. For everything. No thanks necessary, he said, his usual confidence giving way to something almost shy. "Just doing my job." "Is that all it was?" Ruby asked softly, surprised by her own boldness. Isaac held her gaze for a long moment. "No," he admitted finally, "not all." The ride back to town was a spectacle that drew everyone onto the streets, the new marshal bringing in Thaddeus Anderson and his men, with Ruby Anderson riding tall beside him. By nightfall, all 4 men were locked in the town's small jail, with the doctor attending to Thaddeus's and the drifter's wounds. "They'll face the judge when he arrives next week," Isaac told Ruby as they stood outside the jail. "With the evidence we have and eyewitness accounts of yesterday's auction attempt, your uncle will be going away for a long time." "And the ranch?" Ruby asked. "According to the telegram, Mr. Garfield is sending the original will by stagecoach. Once the judge reviews it, he should formally recognize you as the rightful owner." Isaac hesitated. "But it's a big place to run alone." "I managed alongside my father for years," Ruby said with quiet confidence. "I can do it again." Isaac smiled. "I don't doubt that for a minute." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Ruby divided her time between helping at the marshal's office and making trips to the ranch to assess what remained and what had been taken. Isaac accompanied her when his duties allowed, and together they began compiling an inventory of missing items that could be claimed as stolen property once the judge arrived. Word of Thaddeus's arrest and the circumstances surrounding it had spread throughout the county. To Ruby's surprise, several neighbors who had kept their distance during her uncle's reign now came forward, offering help, returning items he had sold them that they suspected were not his to sell, and sharing stories of their own encounters with his dishonesty. "People were afraid of him," Mrs. Holbrook explained one evening as Ruby helped her prepare supper. "But now that he's locked up and facing justice, they're finding their courage again." "Thanks to Isaac," Ruby said, unable to keep the admiration from her voice. Mrs. Holbrook gave her a knowing look. "He's a fine man, our new marshal. Handsome, too." Ruby blushed. "I suppose he is." "And he looks at you like you hung the moon and stars," the older woman continued, smiling at Ruby's evident embarrassment. A blind person could see it. "He's just being kind," Ruby protested, though her heart skipped at the suggestion. "Kindness doesn't make a man's eyes light up the way his do when you walk into a room," Mrs. Holbrook said sagely. "Mark my words, that man has more than professional interest in your welfare." That night, Ruby lay awake long after the house had grown quiet, pondering Mrs. Holbrook's words. Was it possible that Isaac felt something for her, beyond duty? And what of her own feelings, which grew stronger with each day spent in his company? She had never given much thought to romance before. There had been a few boys who caught her eye in school, and once a young cowhand on a neighboring ranch who had made her heart flutter when he tipped his hat to her. But none had affected her the way Isaac did, with his quiet strength, his unwavering principles, and the gentleness that belied his formidable exterior. The following day brought the arrival of the stagecoach from Phoenix, carrying Mr. Garfield himself, rather than just the will he had promised to send. "Miss Anderson," the elderly lawyer greeted her warmly when she met him at the stage station. "When I received the marshal's telegram, I knew I had to come personally. Your father was a dear friend, and I've been worried about you since I heard of his passing." Over lunch at the hotel, Mr. Garfield explained that he had been suspicious when he learned Thaddeus had taken over the ranch. "Joseph specifically told me he didn't trust his brother with a brass penny, let alone his daughter's future," the lawyer said. "That's why he named Abner Wilson as your advisor until you came of age. But when I wrote to inquire after you, the letter was returned unopened." "Mr. Wilson moved to California last year," Ruby explained. "Uncle Thaddeus must have intercepted your letter." Mr. Garfield nodded grimly. "I feared something was amiss, but I had no legal standing to intervene without evidence of wrongdoing." He smiled at Isaac, who had joined them for the meeting. "It seems Providence sent you at just the right moment, Marshal Prescott." With Mr. Garfield's arrival and the original will now in the judge's hands, events moved swiftly. Judge Harrison, a stern but fair man in his 60s, convened a special hearing the day after his arrival in town. The evidence against Thaddeus was overwhelming: the forged will, eyewitness accounts of the attempted auction, and the armed confrontation at the ranch. "Thaddeus Anderson," Judge Harrison pronounced, his voice filling the makeshift courtroom at the town hall. This court finds you guilty of fraud, forgery of legal documents, attempted human trafficking, theft, and attempted murder. I hereby sentence you to 15 years in the territorial prison." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowded room. Ruby sat in the front row, feeling not triumph, but a profound relief. The nightmare that had begun with her parents' deaths was finally ending. Furthermore, the judge continued, this court recognizes Ruby Anderson as the sole heir and rightful owner of the Anderson Ranch and all associated assets, as stipulated in the legitimate will of Joseph Anderson. He banged his gavel. Court dismissed. Outside the town hall, well-wishers surrounded Ruby, offering congratulations and support. Mr. Garfield promised to help her recover any assets her uncle had sold off illegally, and several ranchers volunteered hands to help get her place back in working order. When the crowd finally dispersed, Ruby found Isaac waiting patiently at the edge of the street. "Congratulations," he said, with a smile that reached his eyes. "Justice prevailed." "Thanks to you," Ruby replied. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "Seeing that smile on your face is payment enough," he said, then looked embarrassed at his own candor. "I mean, seeing justice served is what I signed on for." Ruby gathered her courage. "Mrs. Holbrook is cooking a special dinner tonight to celebrate. I'd be honored if you would join us." Isaac's smile broadened. "I'd be delighted." The dinner that evening was a joyous affair. Mrs. Holbrook had outdone herself, preparing a feast of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie. Her other boarders, 2 school teachers, and a young widow who worked at the general store joined them, along with Mr. Garfield and the town doctor. Isaac arrived looking unusually nervous, wearing a clean shirt and carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked on his way. "These are for you," he said, handing them to Ruby with an almost boyish shyness, "to celebrate your victory." As the evening progressed, Ruby found herself repeatedly drawn to Isaac's side, their conversation flowing easily from serious topics to shared laughter. She noticed how his eyes followed her when she moved about the room, and how he listened intently to everything she said, as if her thoughts and opinions were treasures to be valued. When dinner was over and the other guests had departed, Isaac lingered, offering to help with the dishes despite Mrs. Holbrook's protests that guests shouldn't work. "It's the least I can do for such a wonderful meal," he insisted, rolling up his sleeves to plunge his hands into the dishwater beside Ruby. They worked in companionable silence for a while, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed plates back and forth. Each touch sent a pleasant shiver up Ruby's arm. "What will you do now?" Isaac asked eventually. "With the ranch, I mean." "Rebuild," Ruby said simply. "Start small maybe with just a few cattle and horses and work my way back up. My father always said good ranching is about patience." Isaac nodded. "He sounds like a wise man. I wish I could have met him." "He would have liked you," Ruby said softly. "He valued honesty and courage above all else." When the dishes were done and Mrs. Holbrook had tactfully retired to her room with a book, Isaac and Ruby found themselves alone in the parlor. The lamps were turned low, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. "I should probably go," Isaac said, though he made no move toward the door. "It's still early," Ruby pointed out, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. Isaac took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. "Ruby, there's something I need to say. These past days, working with you, getting to know you, they've been the best days I've had in a long time, maybe ever." Ruby felt warmth bloom in her chest. "For me, too. You're remarkable," he continued earnestly. "Your strength, your kindness, your determination. I've never met anyone like you." He took a step closer. "I know we haven't known each other long, but I feel a connection to you that I can't explain." "I feel it too," Ruby whispered. Isaac's eyes searched hers. "I don't want to presume, and the last thing I want is for you to feel pressured in any way. You've just regained your independence, and I would understand completely if you wanted to focus on that." Ruby smiled, touched by his consideration. "Isaac Prescott, are you trying to court me or talk yourself out of it?" A surprised laugh escaped him. "I suppose I'm not doing a very good job of either." "Then let me help," Ruby said, summoning all her courage. She stepped forward and placed her hand gently on his cheek. "I would very much like to be courted by you, if that's what you're asking." The look of joy that lit Isaac's face was answer enough. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a tender, questioning kiss. Ruby responded with a gentle pressure of her own, her heart soaring at this new, exquisite connection between them. When they broke apart, both were slightly breathless, their eyes shining with shared wonder. "I should definitely go now," Isaac said with a reluctant smile, "before Mrs. Holbrook comes in and finds me compromising your reputation." Ruby laughed softly. "I think she'd be more likely to start planning the wedding." The word hung between them, not frightening, but full of possibility. Isaac took her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "One step at a time," he said. "Though I must admit, I like the direction we're heading." The following weeks were the happiest Ruby could remember since her parents' deaths. Each day brought new progress at the ranch, fences mended, fields cleared, and the house slowly refurnished with items recovered from those to whom Thaddeus had sold or given them. True to his word, Mr. Garfield had launched legal proceedings to reclaim property that had been improperly sold. Many neighbors voluntarily returned items, asking only for the return of whatever they had paid Thaddeus. The bank in Phoenix, upon receiving documentation of the fraud, released funds that had been in her father's account, providing Ruby with operating capital to restart the ranch operations. Isaac was a constant presence through it all, helping with repairs when his duties allowed, and often bringing dinner from town when he knew Ruby had been working from dawn to dusk. Their courtship progressed with a natural ease that felt both exciting and comfortable, as if they had known each other far longer than mere weeks. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the newly repaired porch swing, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Isaac turned to Ruby with an unusually serious expression. "I've been thinking," he began, taking her hand in his. "The territorial governor has asked me to consider a more permanent appointment here in Copper Springs. The town's growing, and they want a steady law presence." Ruby squeezed his hand encouragingly. "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity. You've already made such a difference here." "I've asked them for time to consider it," Isaac continued, "because my decision depends on something else entirely." "Oh?" Ruby asked, her heart beginning to race as she sensed what might be coming. Isaac slid from the swing to kneel before her, still holding her hand. From his pocket, he produced a small velvet box. "Ruby Anderson, these past months have shown me what I want for the rest of my life, and that's you, your strength, your kindness, your determination, and your love. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of joy sprang to Ruby's eyes as he opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring with a small but brilliant diamond. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Isaac, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger with slightly trembling hands, then rose to kiss her a kiss full of promise and shared dreams. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling so widely it almost hurt. "I love you, Ruby Anderson," Isaac said, his voice husky with emotion. "From the moment I rode in and saw you standing on that auction block, something in me knew you were special. I just never imagined how quickly you would become essential to my happiness." "And I love you, Isaac Prescott," Ruby replied, her fingers tracing the contours of his face as if to memorize them. "My hero in more ways than I can count." Their wedding took place that October, with the entire town turning out to celebrate. The church was decorated with autumn flowers and leaves, and Ruby wore a beautiful ivory gown that Mrs. Holbrook and the other ladies had helped her make. Mr. Garfield gave her away, his eyes misty as he placed her hand in Isaac's at the altar. "Your parents would be so proud," he whispered. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard under the golden cottonwoods. There was music and dancing, laughter and tears, as the community celebrated not just the union of two beloved members, but also the transformation their love had brought to Copper Springs. As the sun began to set, casting that same magical light that had illuminated their engagement, Isaac led Ruby away from the festivities for a private moment. "Happy, Mrs. Prescott?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "And you?" "I have everything a man could want," Isaac said, his eyes reflecting the sunset's glow. "A beautiful wife, a promising future, and land enough to build our dreams on." Speaking of building, Ruby said with a mysterious smile, I've been thinking about expanding the house, perhaps adding a nursery. Isaac's eyes widened. Are you saying? Ruby laughed and shook her head. Not yet, but someday soon, I hope. I want to fill this house with love and laughter and children our children. Isaac's kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. Nothing would make me happier, he whispered against her lips. As they returned to their guests hand in hand, Ruby couldn't help but marvel at the journey that had brought her here. From the despair of that auction block to the joy of this perfect day, all because a brave man had ridden in at exactly the right moment and refused to look the other way. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. On the porch, someone struck up a fiddle tune, and soon couples were dancing in the yard again. Isaac bowed formally to Ruby, extending his hand. May I have this dance, Mrs. Prescott? For this dance and all the others, she replied, stepping into his arms as naturally as breathing. For the rest of our lives. And as they moved together under the emerging stars, surrounded by friends who had become family, Ruby knew with absolute certainty that this was just the beginning of their story. A love born in the wild moment of rescue, tempered through challenges, and now stretching endless as the western sky before them. 5 years later, the Anderson Prescott Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory. The herd had grown to over 500 head of cattle, and their horse breeding program had gained recognition throughout the Southwest. The house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family, 3-year-old Joseph, named for Ruby's father, and 1-year-old Emma, who had her mother's auburn hair and her father's blue eyes. Isaac continued to serve as marshal, bringing law and order to a town that was rapidly growing into a respectable community. Ruby managed the ranch with skill and innovation, introducing new breeding stock and farming techniques that increased their yields year after year. On warm evenings, they still sat on the porch swing, watching their children play in the yard where once an auction block had stood. Sometimes Ruby would catch Isaac watching her with that same look of wonder he'd had on their wedding day. What are you thinking? She would ask, and he would smile and say, just that I'm the luckiest man alive, all because I happened to ride into town at exactly the right moment. Providence, Ruby would reply, remembering Mr. Garfield's words from long ago. You were meant to find me. And I'll keep finding you, Isaac would promise, every day for the rest of our lives. In the distance, the sun would set on another day in their shared paradise, the Wild West tamed by love that had begun in the most unexpected circumstances, her uncle's cruel auction stopped by a cowboy who became her hero, her husband, and the father of her children. A love story written in the dust and dreams of the Arizona territory, as enduring as the mountains that watched over their home.